Lawyers of Reddit, what is the dumbest thing your client has done to ruin a case? Part 2. Not my client, but defendant posted a Facebook status along the lines of, that he had taken care of business, and the world is a better place because of it. He was charged with battery after putting someone in the hospital that had attacked his 14-year-old daughter. The person didn't have a clear memory of the incident, and other testimony later revealed, the person beat up had an alibi for the attack in question. Most likely the girl had made up the story to avoid trouble from being out drinking underage, though we never got the full story. Anyways, the dad was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. What a question. How much time do you have? I have hundreds of stories of clients making dumb decisions. One particular client that comes to mind is a guy who committed a spree of burglaries while on electronic monitoring for another case. The state brought a list of his coordinates to his bond hearing. I actually made the argument that he is clearly not a flight risk, since he actually kept his monitor on, and that the court should release him on the same terms as his other case. The judge looked at me like a crazy person and held my client without bond. I'm not a lawyer, but the local news ran a clip, over and over, from a murder trial where the defendant took the stand against their lawyer's advice. The defense was claiming self-defense. As the prosecution read transcripts from damning jail phone calls, the guy on trial, not his lawyer, called for an objection. It threw everyone for a loop. The judge asked him why he called for an objection. Dude was honest, and said, "I didn't know they'd actually listen to my calls." A recess was granted, and dude took a plea deal when court resumed. Not a lawyer, but my ex totally effed his custody case. In a nutshell, the mother took off with the kid, and refused to return him, in a state where that kind of action would get even supervised visitation taken from her. When she finally sent the child for visitation, the child had visible injuries caused by her boyfriend, and the child told his teacher at school, completely unprompted, that the boyfriend had hurt him. My ex's parents hired an attorney for him, and they got an ex-parte order to keep the child. At the first hearing after the ex-parte order, both the mother and father were ordered to take drug tests before the next hearing. My ex had a history of drug use, weed. His attorney told him he could get the next hearing pushed back by more than a month, so that he could be sure he would test clean, and my ex told him not to worry about it. Then did some cocaine, and failed the drug test. Then didn't show for court, and refused to contact his attorney for months, until the attorney had himself removed as the attorney on record. The child was actually at the mother's for visitation when the results came back, so she was able to get an ex-parte order to keep him. The reality was, he didn't actually want full responsibility for the child, but refused to admit that to his parents. So he deliberately blew the test, and then claimed that since he worked in construction, he must have been exposed to something that caused a failed drug test. I don't know if his parents really believe that, but I was with him for several years. Before I found out the whole story, he had previously told me he didn't have money for an attorney to fight it, so he just gave her custody, and I left him immediately after finding out the truth. It was bad enough that he just didn't want to be a full-time parent. But to do that in a situation when you know your child is being abused. Needless to say, it was one of the things that helped me figure out he was a sociopath. Legal videographer here. Videotaped a deposition for a man claiming work injuries so severe he could not raise his right hand above his shoulder, and his shoulder was in pain whenever he even tried to raise it above the shoulder. Sued his employer, claiming it was a work injury. Then came his very first deposition. Does anybody know the first thing the court reporter asks of the person testifying? The reporter swears them in by saying, "Would you please raise your right hand and repeat after me?" Then administers the oath to tell the truth. Man who claimed not be able to raise his hand above his shoulder raised his hand way above his shoulder. That hand and arm went up like a rocket. The guy did not even realize what he had done, and kept his arm up through the whole oath. Neither plaintiff or defense counsel caught it. The court reporter and I just looked at each other and let the depo play out. I was hired by defense counsel and showed him the first 20 seconds of the video, and took home a nice bonus because of it. Case was dropped shortly after that depo. Briefly, he had to testify that doing X thing would not cost him a lot of money. The judge asked him how much money would it cost for him, and he said an amount which was not too much for him, because he was rich, but it was a lot compared to what everybody in the courtroom was making. Other case. The day before the court I tell him exactly what he is going to answer to certain questions. I specifically tell him to answer X when asked. Time comes, judge asks, he completely loses it, he gets a panic attack, he can't even speak a single word. He just looks at the judge with the 1,000-yard stare. Disaster. Not a lawyer, but I know a cop who went to a report of a guy being mugged. What did he steal? 275 pounds in cash, and about 30 10-pound deals of crack and heroin. Really? Yeah. It was him that did it, known him years, and he's a rival. Cop writes statement, detailing what happened, and what was stolen. Sign here, if that's all absolutely correct, and exactly what happened, and was stolen. Guy signs. Cheers. You're under arrest, for being concerned in the supply of Class A drugs. The cop prosecuted the caller, for possession with intent to supply, and the guy that robbed him, for robbery and possession, with intent to supply. I am a lawyer. I was cross-examining a slip-and-fall plaintiff on the stand in trial, after like 2 years of litigation. We were going over some pictures he took, when he let slip that the picture of the two signs was missing. I grilled him on what he meant, until the judge chastised me for trying to conduct discovery during trial, which is supposedly not allowed. He had clearly concealed evidence though. We took a break for the day, and the next day, he came back with the photo in question, which showed that he had walked squarely between two wet floor signs to go down the Kroger aisle, that he immediately slipped and fell in. He did not recover any money in that one, despite the horrific defense venue. The judge who jumped all over me for exploring obvious evidence tampering was later appointed to the federal bench here in Atlanta. One of my brother-in-law lawyers, there were 3 at one point, was described as incompetent and failing to provide adequate counsel by his former client on death row for failing to get an innocent verdict. The problem was that the client, since executed, went to his local bar immediately after committing the murder at a local grocery store in broad daylight and proceeded to brag for hours how he'd killed the victim in very specific detail. Also, there were something more than a dozen eyewitnesses. Client accused of punching another man and knocking a tooth out. He said numerous times on the stand that he had arthritis and was not capable of closing his fist to form the punches described by the victim. Partway through his cross-examination, the magistrate stopped him to state on the record that he had watched my client clench his fist numerous times since he made that statement. He was found guilty. Pro bono, Violence Against Women Act, case. Should have been a straightforward petition. Ran a Freedom of Information Act search on the client before the final submission, just in case. Turns out, she had been deported from Guam, and then while her immigration ban was still in place, she entered the mainland U.S. without status, equals permanently ineligible for adjustment. When I asked why she had not disclosed this during intake, her response was, "Oh, I thought Guam was its own country, and not part of the U.S., so it wouldn't matter." A friend was doing the workman's comp, as well as suing the company for a few million. Could not bend over, raise his arms, plus everything he could think of. Taking this stand, using a cane. Lawyer asked him to read the highlighted parts from the local paper. A week before, he had won a martial arts tournament. Can you explain that? Next 15 minutes, he explained each kick, punch, etc. with a big smile. I rest my case. Jury foreman asked the judge if they had to leave the room, or could they just announce the verdict. Not a lawyer, but I am a former police officer, and spent a lot of time in courtrooms. One guy was on trial for a DUI, and he wanted the judge to know that the cop who arrested him was just some punk kid. He insisted that he'd only had 2 bottles of wine, and his lawyer keeps trying to get him to stop his stream of verbal diarrhea, and he just keeps going. Eventually, the judge says, "I think you should take a moment to confer with your attorney," and the guy says, "Don't interrupt me, I'm not a child." Judge smiled and leaned back and said, "By all means, please continue." Dude's attorney just looked like he was deflating. Commit robbery in order to hire an expensive attorney with minimal experience in criminal law, rather than accept a seasoned public defender. When my mom was pregnant with me, she worked at a savings loan place. I don't know if it was a full-fledged bank or not. Anyhow, luckily she was out for maternity leave, because a guy came in and robbed the place, but for no reason at all. He killed all of the workers there that day, 2 to 3 people. His court docs say, he robbed the place because he needed to buy his daughter a car for her 16th birthday. One of the ladies was like really good friends with my mom, and also several months pregnant. Not my client, but I watched someone admit, in open court, to solicitation of prostitution, during allocution. This was for statutory R, which has a mandatory minimum sentence in my state. Judge was already going to give him the minimum, so, there was literally nothing he could say that was going to make this go any better than it already was at that moment, but the defendant elected to speak, as his attorney died slowly at the table. Went into a whole speech about how this charge was unfair, and it was going to ruin his life and business, pretty usual. But then he went on to say that he usually checks the ages of his hookers, and that this time he didn't, and of course she was underage, and now here he is. Judge asked him to repeat it, and he said the exact same thing, while defense counsel just hung his head down. This defendant was a character, had a lot of other eccentric habits and history, that I heard about later. The judge was having a pretty good day, so, he kept the sentence to the mandatory minimum, and I don't think the prosecutor's office took up the additional charge, but it was still fun to watch someone just absolutely talk themselves into a much worse situation for no reason but ego. Also, the number of people who show up to court for drug cases, wearing weed or 420 shirts, is effing incredible. And the kids, who used to steal TomToms and other GPS units out of cars, and then give a sob story about wanting to go to law school, but these charges will ruin that chance, became a running joke at the courthouse. I was at court once, fighting a traffic ticket, and a guy's lawyer was pleading no contest to a charge he got for having a firearm on probation. It sounded like he was getting more probation, and it would be done with that. Then the judge says, "Do you have anything to say before we move forward?" And the guy says, "I didn't know having a gun was against the rules. And I had a gun, so, I guess, that makes me guilty." Smiled like he just stuck it to the man. The look on the lawyer and judge's face were of so much disappointment. I was called for jury duty, and was sitting in the courtroom, watching the other potential jurors get questioned by the attorneys, just waiting for my possible turn to be questioned. One of the charges was aggravated assault. The defense asked one juror, who was a professional videographer, if her career made her more or less likely to put stock in video footage. To me, this was a hint, but not admission, that video footage would be a big part of the case. Before the juror could even answer, the defendant yelled from his table, "I had a mask on. You can't even see my face." The entire room went silent for about 5 seconds, before the defense attorney regained his composure, and asked the judge to dismiss the jury pool. The judge dismissed us back to the holding room. 5 minutes later, one of the clerks of the court came in, and told us, even the already selected jurors, that the trial was being rescheduled, and we were all dismissed. Not a lawyer, but I was in a jury, and on the first day of trial after jury selection, during a lunch break, a random friend of the defendant came up to us, saying all sorts of nonsense about how defendant was framed, and to look up specific statutes citing the law. This was for a serious drug trafficking and violence case. We all reported what happened to the bailiff, so we could be properly thrown off the jury. He said, "Just sit tight, it probably won't matter." The case was settled by the time we came back to court, and the judge threw out the settlement offer, saying he, the judge, didn't appreciate the defendant wasting everyone's time. Wild stuff. Horrible friends, horrible lawyers on the defense, and I assume the defendant was also equally horrible for simply associating with these people, and also for the crime he admitted to, and is still serving time for. Not an attorney, but I had a woman I arrested ask for a probable cause hearing. The charge was for escape. She'd cut off her GPS anklet and ran, and PC hearings for these sorts of things were very uncommon. Normally, only new public defenders use them, outside of a couple of other defense strategies, for more serious offenses. Point being, there wasn't a whole lot of reason for having the hearing. She cut the anklet off, we had evidence of that, due to the anklet having been recovered, LOL. Anyway, not only did she want the PC hearing, she demanded to testify. Her public defender, a newish one, at the time, strongly recommended against it. He went and got another PD, who had a good rapport with this woman. Obviously, she was very familiar with our criminal court, who again recommended that she not testify. Nope, our girl wanted her time on the stand. So, the hearing goes forward. Before it started, even the judge strongly recommended the defendant not go through with the hearing. Well, she did. Her testimony was that she'd been taken against her will by her boyfriend, and that her made her cut off the anklet, blah, blah. I was called up as a witness, provided screenshots of the defendant's Facebook account, where she was shown with her boyfriend, smiling happily, enjoying time with him and her daughter, etc. All date and time stamped, of course. Obviously, probable cause was found by the judge that a crime had been committed, and the case was sent to the grand jury for indictment. But, actually having a judge tell the defendant that testifying was a bad idea was a first for me. A foreign client had very limited command of the local language. We tried to prove that the client acted in good faith and was very cooperative, and also asked the client not to directly contact with the respondent. However, the client was very happy to write multiple letters to the respondent in a very broken local language, in which, among others, called the attorney of a respondent a cunning little whore, and the respondent was happy to submit it to the court. My lawyer husband had a case where he basically fired the client. It was a civil case, the guy was in the right, all he had to do was turn up and testify. He was a no-show. Turned out, the idiot got drunk, had a fight with his daughter-in-law, slugged her, and she had him thrown in jail. No one wanted to bail the guy out. My husband said he didn't want to represent somebody who would do that, and send him to another law firm. Not a lawyer, but used to investigate road traffic accidents and similar claims. The amount of passengers who couldn't provide the most basic details of the road traffic accidents they were supposedly involved in was a phenomenal thing to behold. I recall one incident where, ostensibly, there were 4 people in the car: brothers, sister and mother. The brothers, driver and front seat passenger, were able to recall the key details. But the mother and sister couldn't offer any compelling evidence that they were in the car. They couldn't remember where they were sat, what time of day it was, what the weather was, where they were coming from, or going to, where the impact came from, what the other vehicle looked like, color, type, manufacturer, what happened afterwards, whether the emergency services attended. We always tried to be sympathetic to the fallibility of memory. But there is a limit. Unrelated advice: if you are ever planning to fake a claim, maybe have a sit-down with all participants and agree the key details in advance. Just the basics, at least. 20 years ago, in a small town near me, in the days when city transit buses were not all outfitted with cameras, the city was driving an empty bus between 2 garage locations for maintenance. The bus was involved in a minor traffic accident in the middle of downtown, near the courthouse. There were quite a number of people that saw the accident. This was confirmed within the next few days, when the city had a barrage of soft tissue injury claims from alleged passengers on the bus. I was a 3 student in school's family law clinic. We had one of those custody cases that just would not die. The husband remarried, and stepmom did not want biomom to exist in their happy family, and dragged this mom to court for the smallest things, to try and get full custody, instead of 50-50 with her spirit son. We were in court every other month, just for this case. The court never budged on custody. Eventually, stepmom decided us meddling kids were the only thing keeping her from her spirit son. Stepmom called the law school and made a complaint against my team, accusing us of doing really horrible stuff to the child and threatening them. They then demanded we be expelled, or the university would be sued. We filed an emergency hearing and told the judge everything, and asked for sanctions and argued harassment. Judge found the couple in contempt for threatening us to sway the case. The judge then said he questioned their ability to effectively co-parent and act in the child's best interests. Mom was given primary custody, and they got every other weekend and some holidays. The judge also decided that given the couple's history, they were harassing the mom using the court, and banned them from further custody filings. Later we found out the couple also filed a bar complaint against our professor, too. That was investigated and found without merit. I am a lawyer. I could write a book about this. Most dumb things happen when I am out of office or in trial and can't correct their behavior. Most common: lying about easily verifiable, small things on the stand. Ruins credibility completely. We know you didn't pick your child up every single time from daycare, because the daycare has a log and your mom signed the kid out 50% of the time. We know you filed multiple restraining orders on your spouse, because it is electronic public record. Second most common: changing their story on the stand. I prepared for facts to be the way you told me. I can't prepare for something I don't know about. Third most common. Completely ignoring advice. I told you that you couldn't take that $150,000 out of the bank account without repercussions. Incoming contempt. Order to sell the marital home. Home is actively for sale with a realtor. Client puts padlock on house, so no one can access it or sell it. Here comes contempt. After 5 years, I finally got a client custody of the kids. When the client went to pick up the kids, client brought a known violent felon, a loaded gun, and got in a physical fight with the guardian of the child. Emergency petition filed, children removed from her care. Had them for less than a week. Had the audacity to call me a bad attorney in front of the judge, because the kids were removed. Judge laughed, and informed the client I had won the case for her, until her own actions caused this reversal. Allowed me to withdraw on the spot. One of the first, and only, divorce cases I took as a solo, was a man who said his wife had run away back to Nepal, and abandoned him and their 7-year-old daughter, in the States. He said he had no way to get in touch with her, or find her, and that she was likely with a new lover. So, we effect service by publication, file everything at court, and cases rolling along uncontested, until the wife shows up, gets her own lawyer, and shows that her husband knew where she was, the whole time. He admits to me via email, that he may have been a bit deceptive with me. I told him that if he was willing to be fully truthful with me going forward, we could work with wife's attorney to come up with an agreement, but that he would need to pay me more, because now it's a messy contested divorce, and his small retainer for uncontested is depleted. He did not do either of these things. I had zero faith he would not continue to lie. He gave me more reasons to see that he was continuing to lie to me, so, after telling him I could not represent him anymore, I filed for a withdrawal of representation, a mandatory one, based on fraud to the court. Show up to court for the motion hearing, and he stands up and says he objects, and doesn't want me to withdraw. Said, I'm only trying to walk because of the money, and then tries to hand over every communication we have had to the court. He printed all of our emails. Wife's lawyer looks at me and, as client is trying to hand these over, informs him that they would get to see everything as well, so maybe that's not a great idea. Wife's lawyer was really great. Judge is dumbfounded. I tell him it's a mandatory withdrawal, and if I give any additional info, I'm prejudicing my soon-to-be ex-client. Judge briefly tried to explain to client what that meant, and allowed my motion. He shut up, and I walked out.